What if I told you? A war that killed millions was never truly explained to the world? What if one man refused to let that silence continue? And what if the truth behind that war could cost a global power $6 trillion? This is not just history. This is Nnamdi Kanu, and the story that refuses to die. Let me take you into a story that has never truly ended. It is the kind of story that people whisper about, argue over, and sometimes avoid completely. Not because it is unclear, but because it is uncomfortable. Because once you begin to understand it, you cannot easily forget it. At the center of this story is a man whose voice has refused to fade, Nnamdi Kanu. For years, he has spoken about Biafra, not as a distant idea, not as a political slogan, but as something real. Something painful. Something unfinished. To some people, he is seen as a troublemaker. To others, he is seen as a symbol of resistance. But whether people support him or criticize him, one thing is certain: he has forced a conversation that many believed had already been buried. And that conversation begins long before him. It begins in 1914. That was the year a decision was made by the British colonial administration, a decision that would shape the future of millions of people who had no say in it. Under the authority of Lord Lugard, different regions, different cultures, different beliefs, different histories, were merged into a single entity called Nigeria. It was not done through agreement. It was not done through dialogue. It was done through power. To the British administration, this was efficient. It made governance easier. It made resource management simpler. But for the people within those borders, it created a fragile structure, one that carried tension from the very beginning. For decades, that tension remained, sometimes quiet, sometimes visible, but always present. Then came the 1960s. Nigeria had gained independence, but independence did not erase division. If anything, it exposed it. Political instability grew. Trust between regions weakened. And then violence began. In the northern region, thousands of Igbos were killed in what many described as organized attacks. Families were torn apart. Communities were destroyed. Survivors fled, carrying fear and anger with them. For the people of the eastern region, it was no longer just a political issue. It was a question of survival. And so, in 1967, a decision was made. The eastern region declared itself independent. It became Biafra. But that declaration did not bring peace. It brought war. A war that would go on to become one of the most devastating in modern African history. Now, when people talk about the Biafran War, they often focus on the battles, the strategies, the political decisions. But what is often overlooked is the human cost. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the politics, there were ordinary people, families, children, communities, caught in a situation they did not create. And then came the blockade. It was not just a military tactic. It was something far more destructive. Food stopped entering Biafra. Medicine stopped entering Biafra. Slowly, silently, a different kind of weapon began to take effect: starvation. Children became the most visible victims. Their images spread across the world: fragile bodies, empty eyes, lives fading in a way that words can hardly describe. And yet, despite global awareness, the suffering continued. By the time the war ended in 1970, millions of people had died. Many of them were children. Now imagine that for a moment. Not just numbers. Not statistics. But real lives. Real stories. Gone. And yet, after the war, something unusual happened. There was no global reckoning.
No widespread accountability.
No deep international reflection on what had occurred. Instead, the story slowly faded from global attention. But not from memory. Because memory does not disappear. It waits. And years later, voices began to rise again. One of the loudest among them was Nnamdi Kanu. Through his speeches and broadcasts, he began to bring the story back into public consciousness. He spoke about the war, about the suffering, about the silence that followed. And more importantly, he began to question that silence. Why was this not widely discussed? Why was it not deeply taught? Why did it feel like something people were careful about mentioning? These questions did not stay local. They began to spread. And then came a new layer to the story. A claim that shocked many. A former mayor from the United States, Mike Arnold, suggested that one of the reasons this history is not openly confronted is because it could lead to a massive financial consequence. A reparations claim. Not in millions. Not in billions. But in trillions. Approximately $6 trillion. Now whether that figure is accurate or not is a matter of debate. But the idea itself is powerful. Because it suggests that what happened during that time was not just tragic. It was unresolved. And if it were ever fully addressed, it could have consequences far beyond history. And this is why Nnamdi Kanu's voice continues to matter. Because he is not just speaking about independence. He is speaking about memory. About justice. About the idea that some stories should not be allowed to disappear simply because they are inconvenient. And as long as that voice continues, the story of Biafra will not remain silent. When I first started hearing the name Nnamdi Kanu, I didn't think much of it. It sounded like one of those political topics people argue about online, something distant, something complicated, something you could easily ignore. But over time, I began to notice something different. Every time the topic came up, people reacted strongly. It wasn't casual. It wasn't light. It was intense. Some people defended him passionately. Others rejected him completely. But almost nobody was neutral. And that made me curious. Why does this name carry so much weight? So I started listening more carefully. Not just to the arguments, but to the emotion behind them. And slowly, I realized something important. This was not just about politics. It was about something deeper. Something that had not healed. Every time Biafra was mentioned, it felt like opening an old wound. And that made me ask questions. What really happened during that time? Why does it still matter so much today? And why does it feel like the full story is not widely known? Then I started hearing Nnamdi Kanu speak. And one thing stood out immediately. He kept going back to the past. Again and again. The war. The killings. The starvation. The silence. It was like he was trying to remind people of something that was being forgotten. Or maybe something that was never fully explained. At first, I thought, maybe this is just his perspective. But then I began to look deeper. I started reading more. Listening more. And what I found was not simple. It was complicated. Painful. And in many ways, incomplete. Because when millions of people die, you expect the world to remember. You expect the world to talk about it. You expect there to be some kind of global acknowledgement. But in this case, it felt different. It felt quieter. And that silence became even more noticeable when I heard about the $6 trillion claim. At first, it sounded unbelievable. Almost exaggerated. But then I thought about it differently. What if the number is not the main point? What if it is just a way of expressing the scale of what was lost? Because when you think about it, decades of oil revenue, lives lost, communities destroyed, how do you even begin to measure that? Can you really put a number on it? And if you try, what kind of number would it be? That is when I began to understand why this conversation is so sensitive. Because it is not just about the past. It is about responsibility. It is about whether people are willing to ask difficult questions. And that is not easy. Especially when those questions involve powerful institutions, powerful countries, and decisions made a long time ago. But then I look at Nnamdi Kanu again. And I realize something. Whether people agree with him or not, he is doing something important. He is refusing to let the conversation end. He is insisting that the story be revisited. That it be examined. That it be understood. And that changes everything. Because once a conversation starts again, it cannot easily be stopped. People begin to ask questions. More people begin to pay attention. And slowly, the silence begins to break. For me, this is what makes the story so powerful. Not just what happened in the past, but the fact that it is still being discussed today. Because that means it is not over. It means there are still things that need to be understood. Still questions that need answers. And until those answers come, the story will continue. Let me speak plainly. What we are dealing with here is not just history. It is unfinished history. And unfinished history has a way of returning. Often when people hear a number like $6 trillion, their first reaction is to dismiss it. They say it is too large, too unrealistic, too extreme. But they focus on the number and ignore the reasoning behind it. Because that number did not appear out of nowhere. It is based on a series of considerations. Oil revenue generated over decades. The strategic importance of that oil. The economic advantage gained from it. And then the human cost. Millions of lives lost. Communities destroyed. A region that experienced suffering on a massive scale. When you begin to look at these factors together, you start to understand how such a figure can even be discussed. Now, does that mean it would ever be paid? That is not the point. The point is what the conversation represents. Because if Biafra were ever to become independent and bring this issue to the international stage, it would force a global discussion. And that discussion would not be comfortable. It would raise questions about historical responsibility, about external involvement, about decisions made during a critical period. And once those questions are asked, they cannot easily be ignored. This is why voices like Nnamdi Kanu matter. Because they keep the issue alive. They prevent it from being forgotten. They challenge the idea that time alone can erase responsibility. And whether people agree with him or not, his impact is undeniable. Because he has brought attention back to something that many believed was settled. But it was never settled. It was only set aside. And now it is returning. Slowly. But steadily. And when history returns, it does not return quietly. It demands attention. It demands examination. And sometimes, it demands accountability. Some stories are buried. But others wait. And when they return, they don't ask for permission to be heard.